You're listening to the Huddle Up Podcast with Chad Jensen and Zack Kelberman. Join Broncos Country's deep divers at milehighhuddle.com and sound off. And now it's time to drop some knowledge.
Welcome in, everybody, to the Huddle Up Podcast, presented, as always, by Mile High Huddle and 24/7 Sports. I'm your host, Chad Jensen. With me, as always, is my partner in crime. You know him, you love him, as your Denver Broncos reporter for 24/7 Sports. He is Zack Kelberman. Zack, we had our day off. We're back in the saddle. We're going to drop some knowledge on the podcast, and we actually have quite a few things to get to today with OTAs kicking off on Tuesday.
We do, but can we talk about the Broncos draft hat for a second? I don't know. I don't really like it, Chad. What do you think about it?
I think it's kind of tacky. I don't think they're that cool.
It wasn't that creative. I don't know. The Twin Mountains in the background, they smacked the Broncos logo right in the middle.
Right.
It wasn't super, didn't pop to me.
To me, they look like something cheesy that you'd buy off like a Chinese third-hand site.
Yeah, Canal Street.
Yeah, like just not a lot of thought and depth that went into it. But, what's cool about it is, you can buy a piece of merch like that to commemorate the year. And who knows, maybe the Broncos go into they have the 10th overall pick. They got to get a blue chipper, whether it's a quarterback or not. And if you get that hat, whoever they get, maybe it's Devin White, maybe it's Devin Bush, maybe it's Ed Oliver, maybe it's quarterback, whoever, you put that up in your room or whatever. You can wear it once in a while, but you are constantly reminded of, this was the 2019 draft hat, that reminds me of Devin White.
It reminds me of a cheap logo. I like the hat. I liked the hat last year, Chad. I thought that was a much better look, but I digress on this subject.
Yeah. If you guys want to see what that looks like, we have an article up on the website, also on our social channels, so you can go check that out. But we do have a lot to get to. Many storylines popped out of Dove Valley between the last time we were able to talk to you and today. But first, a couple of quick matters of business. As always, a reminder to make sure you're following the show on Twitter. It's easy to do. You can do it while you're listening to the podcast. Open up the app Twitter or do it on your browser. Find @HuddleUpPod. Click the follow button. And from there, you're plugged in. It's a great way to keep your finger on the pulse of what's happening with the Huddle Up podcast in real time. And then again, we gave some shout-outs to everybody on Twitter. I think it was Tuesday. You guys have done a phenomenal job just cranking out the reviews and ratings on iTunes. Some of you don't even listen on iTunes, but you take our calls to action with the utmost seriousness. You're supporting the show, and you're creating or downloading Apple Podcasts just so that you can rate and review the show. And for those of you who have done that, and even if you're just regular listener and you've heeded the call to action, you've left a review on iTunes, whoever has left a review, we thank you. You guys are kicking butt. Like, it's really within the realm of happening that we can get to 200 like we want to. 200 ratings and reviews on iTunes between now and the draft. So it's really easy to do, similar to the Twitter thing. You open it up, you're logged in, you find the podcast, you scroll down to the bottom, leave a creative review. And it doesn't have to be long-winded. You can do 1 or 2 sentences, 5-star rating, boom, close it out, you're done. So take care of that. It's your call to action. Help us get to 200 ratings and reviews between now and the draft. We're sitting at about just under, I think, 130 the last time I checked. All right, Zach, so let's talk about a few things that have come out of the OTAs that kicked off on Tuesday. And the first thing I want to touch on is, this was the Broncos' first chance to really come together. It's not a complete team yet because the draft class and the rookie class, we won't have, that won't exist until the end of the month. But this is the first opportunity for the entire new coaching staff to be merged with the veterans, right? And to come together and for these veterans to hear the talking points and the priorities and the philosophies of Vic Fangio and his staff for the first time. And so, as you know, first impressions are a big deal in terms of buying in and getting excited and just moving forward. First impressions can be extremely huge. And I know you wrote an article with Von Miller talking about that. We'll get to that here in just a second. But I want to read a quote that came via Mike Kliss. Now, this was what Emmanuel Sanders told Mike Kliss. He said, quote, now this is Kliss, I think, paraphrasing Emmanuel Sanders, but he said, quote, "Man, he did really good." This is Sanders talking about Fangio. "The message was strong. It was about the team is bigger than yourself. Pretty much leave your ego at the door. Also, talent is all good, but at the same time, if you're not technically sound, what good does it do if you're not disciplined, close quote. That's from Emmanuel Sanders. But Zach, off the cuff from what Sanders had to say and some of the other buzz from different players like Von Miller, what were your takeaways from the type of message Vic Fangio is presenting for the first time to the Denver Broncos?
I love it. And he's presenting what the Broncos have lacked for the last 2 years, and that's accountability. To me, it's kind of sad that he has to preach the basics of football, Chad. He has to go back to the lifeblood and football 101, because that's how far Denver has gotten off that path. They have played incomplete football, sloppy football, unprepared football, incompetent football the last 2 years. And he's instilling his culture, and he's undoing all of the stink from the Vance Joseph era. And I couldn't love it more, Chad. It totally justifies why I pounded the table for Fangio in the first place. He was the only guy among the coaching candidates in this cycle that would whip the Broncos into shape. He just carries that quiet confidence. He commands a room just on his facial expressions alone, his mannerisms alone. So I couldn't have been more happy with what he's teaching, and it will pay off on the field. I mean, how many times the last couple of years did the Broncos lose a game because of coaching, especially in the last couple seconds? I mean, you add that into the equation, already we're starting to see it pay off.
Yeah, that was one of my, honestly, that's probably my biggest complaint in terms of the end result, the end product. We can get into the weeds in terms of talking about some of the little things about Vance Joseph's regime that really fell short of the mark. But at bottom, where they really fell behind the pack in terms of the AFC West and the other NFL teams in terms of incompetence, was situational football. And One of the reasons why is not just because they're not great tacticians in the moment and decision makers when the pressure's on as coaches, but a lot of that, how you perform and how you execute in those key situational moments is tied to all the little things. And it comes back to Vic Fangio's whole ethos of death by inches, right? If you're doing all the little things right from the word go, the big things take care of themselves. And so if you are doing those little things right, talking about focusing on technique and assignment and all that stuff, keeping it simple, discipline, follow through, intensity, effort, etc., like Von Miller talked about, then when the chips are down and you're in that key moment, you're prepared and your actions flow with much more confidence and authority, basically. And so that's what was lacking, is the message from the get-go, all the details from Vance Joseph's crew. I mean, it was incompetence at the highest level. And with Vic Fangio, like we've said before on the show, it's like having an adult back in the room. And here's one thing that I thought was interesting from Von Miller's quote. In fact, I'm going to play the quote really quick. Here's what Von Miller said about Vic Fangio's message to the team.
Technique, assignment, you really just keep everything simple, but it's easier said than done. And Coach Fangio, he's all about that. Technique, assignment, intensity, effort, and I like that. He's an outside linebacker guru, and he's up next with me.
All right, so that's what Von Miller had to say. Zach, what are your thoughts on that?
I mean, that's what it comes down to, and that's what I'm talking about by football 101. I mean, it really all comes down to coaching in the NFL, Chad, on game days, on Sundays. And the Broncos were not hurting for talent. They did not have the best offense, but on their defense alone, they had more talent than 11 wins within the last 2 years. Their losses were pinned on coaching, a large majority of them. And for the same reasons that he scattered that meeting, or for the same reasons they lost. And Fangio quietly and subtly has taken multiple shots at Vance Joseph the last couple months since he's been hired. Whether it's getting more out of Von Miller or getting more out of the team. He even said they've been slacking since the Super Bowl, Chad.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a major indictment not only on the previous coaching staffs, but also John Elway. So I love the fact that he has big enough cashews to come in and start talking his way and making these proclamations and really setting things straight. I love it so much.
You also wrote the article of Todd Davis talking about how he feels like, to paraphrase him, this season is going to be different for the Broncos, how excited he is to get back to work and learn the new system. But overall, it really feels like a new era is dawning in Denver, and the players, the veterans, seem to be buying in.
there's a different vibe. I mean, can you feel it? It was absent last year with Vance Joseph. There's just a tide has turned. You can feel them sign. You can feel them happy that they know they can rely on their coaches and they can rely on the scheme to put them in the right places to win, not have to win, despite it and in spite of it. So I understand that the offseason is a time for fluff, Chad. I know hope reigns supreme right now. But the breadcrumbs have been laid, and you can tell it's genuine, and you can tell Broncos players and fans are very, very fired up.
Now, as we postulated on, I think it was Tuesday's shows, which we recorded Monday evening, Chris Harris indeed chose not to attend these voluntary portions of OTAs. Now, we'll analyze this thing, but I think the first thing is, what's the message? We talked about the importance, Zach, on that show on Tuesday of, just setting a precedent, solidarity, full show of force. Everybody's buying in, including Chris Harris, but he's not there. And obviously he has a bone to pick with the front office because he's tired of hearing his name brought up and talked about by John Elway in terms of an extension, and nothing's happened. I mean, Troy Rank reported a couple of weeks back, I think it was following the Combine, that, things were building momentum in terms of Chris Harris. Then free agency rolled around, and the Broncos signed 2 corners, one of which was a nickel, right? One of which was Bryce Callahan, which, at that stage, alarm bells had to be going off for Chris Harris. I mean, he's probably, I'm sure, as much as excited to be playing with those guys, but for him, that's got to be an alarm bell because that's his forte, that's his specialty. So we understand why he's saying, look, I'm not, he's not holding out, but he's sending obviously a very clear message that.
I agree with you, Chad, and we literally talked about that the night before the news came out, that we would like the 100% attendance, but if there was one player who would skip, it would be Harris. And I can make the case for both sides, but I'm on Harris' side here. You're talking about an all-pro, perennial Pro Bowler, one of the best corners in the game, still in his prime, been nothing but a team player. He's criminally underpaid. The Broncos shelled out $54 million, $33 million in guarantees to Bryce Callahan and Kareem Jackson. And they let their one star, their homegrown stud, just rot away and have to wait. You need to pay the guy. It shows some goodwill, shows some good faith. Elway did the same thing with Von Miller, and they held out, and that was nasty, and Elway eventually caved. I think in the end he'll cave to Chris Harris Jr., but it's sending a bad message. Why not take care of your own? Even Bill Belichick will hand a player an extension every now and then. I mean, if he can do it, Elway can swallow enough pride to do it too. And I'm not even mad that Harris skipped. To me, it doesn't send a message to Vic Fangio. It sends a message to John Elway that he has no reason to be there, nothing to gain by showing up, Chad, and he's using what little leverage he still has to his advantage.
Yeah, and I don't disagree at all. It does make me nervous, though, just because, I mean, we know if you go back in time, one of the reasons the Denver Broncos allowed Aqib Talib to hit the bricks, and they traded him, obviously, to L.A., was because Bradley Roby was coming up on his 5th year, and they knew they were going to pull the trigger on that. They're already paying Chris Harris, whatever it was, $8-9 million bucks, and they didn't want to have $30 million, allocated to the cornerback position. And yet here they are, and they paid that, they paid the price for choosing to scrimp a little bit at cornerback, as obviously the no-fly zone died an ugly and horrible death last season, with Roby falling off a cliff and the likes of Tremaine Brock just not pulling his fair share of the weight. So maybe it's simply, Zach, John Elway's realizing that you need to be 3 deep there and you need to be willing to pay the price. But if you look at it, I mean, Kareem Jackson came in 3 years, $33 million. That's $11 million. Just using the annual average, okay, that's $11 million. Then you've got Bryce Callahan, 3 years, $21 million, I think it was, right? So $7 million. So now you're up to $18 million in annual average in 2 corners. And then you throw in Chris Harris, who's just under, let's just go with his salary. So he's just under $8 million. Let's just say $8 million. And it starts to add up. You're starting to approach that $30 million number. And Chris Harris, this time around, I mean, his second contract that he got, his first big contract, but it was his second deal. It was a massive increase over what he was earning as a former undrafted rookie playing on a rookie contract. That was a big step forward. But even Zach talked about how he had taken a sweetheart deal for the Broncos to stick around. It was very team friendly. All the buzz that we've heard this time around is that with the dues he's paid, contributing to a championship, 4 Pro Bowls, 3 All-Pro nods, he wants to be paid on a level commensurate with his contribution and his standing in the NFL. And what I see translation is he's not going to be willing to accept, Zach, anything less than what Kareem Jackson got. Nothing less, right? So bare minimum, he's going to be getting $11 million, or at least asking for $11 million from the Denver Broncos. So it starts to add up. So that's what I'm worried about. Now, I don't want fans and listeners of this show to get too paranoid and go down the rabbit hole, but those are the real issues the Broncos are struggling with right now, is figuring out how to prioritize this thing. And the truth is, Zach, there's not going to be a resolution on Chris Harris till after the draft, because the Broncos are going to do their due diligence, just like in that mock draft we talked about a couple shows ago that I did on Friday. I took Rock Ya-Sin in the second round to hedge against the possibility that things don't go swimmingly with Chris Harris in negotiations.
Well, I have one solution to your problem, and that's move Kareem Jackson to safety. And then you have 2 corners, and you have a safety being paid, and you spread it around a little more. And that's what could be done anyway. I just think at this point, it just sets such a bad example to let Chris Harris Jr. waste away, enter a contract year, and not pay the guy. The only thing I can think of, Chad, Elway's impetus behind waiting is until April 26th, day 2 of the draft. Chris Harris won't fetch a first-round pick, but he maybe could fetch a second-rounder. So if he's not traded by that point, he's not getting traded. I don't think it should happen. I don't think it should be even entertained. But if I were Harris, I'd be more worried about Bryce Callahan signing than Kareem Jackson. That to me is, the same type of player, same skill set, and it seems like they're grooming him to take over for him, whether now or a couple years from now.
And he's a Fangio guy, right?
That's right.
He's a devil you know guy, and I'm sure Fangio has the utmost respect for Chris Harris, his talent, his body of work, but the guy he knows is Bryce Callahan. So when it comes to innately being able to execute the system, Callahan's ready to roll. Now, Harris is a veteran. He's been through multiple systems as a pro. It's not going to take him long to pick up the scheme. So it's not going to be an issue, but you can start compounding these little issues, and you hope it just doesn't go down that road. So with Chris Harris, I think, what is this? It's going to be his 9th year in the league. So all of which have been with the Denver Broncos. I mean, he's already bound for the Ring of Fame. He's in that same caliber as a Demaryius Thomas, as a Von Miller. Maybe not quite as high, obviously, as Von, but homegrown guys who made their contribution to world championships, and then or championship in this case, or contributed at an individual level with the accolades that also make the team look good. So I think the Broncos, unless they want to really piss off the fan base and lose some of the guys in the locker room, they need to take care of business with Chris Harris sooner rather than later. Now, for what it's worth, here's what Von Miller had to say about Chris Harris skipping the voluntary portion of OTAs.
It's optional, right? This the optional period to be here, and we all know what type of pro Chris is, on and off the football field, and he's going to be ready to go whenever he's here, and if he's not here, he's still going to be ready to go. We're talking about Strap Harris, so he could be on Mars, and he's still going to be Strap Harris. So, he's going through whatever he's going through right now, and I support him 100%. But when it's time to go, he's going to be ready to go. So, there's really not too much you can say about that. This is 9th year coming up, and whatever he has to do to get ready, I'm for it.
All right, so that's how Von Miller feels about Chris Harris skipping. I mean, as you mentioned earlier, Zach, Von, at a different point in his career, has chosen to absent himself from the team activities when his future and his contract was in doubt. So obviously, he's not going to be tripping too hard on the fact that Chris Harris has to look out for Chris Harris at this moment in time.
I mean, they're also super good friends, and of course, Miller's going to take his side over John Elway, who I'm sure they're not, especially after that trade rumor chat this offseason with his mom. I mean, things haven't been rocky between Miller and the Broncos front office for a while. They haven't been straight for a while, so I'm not surprised he's taking Harris' side. And look at it from Harris' point of view. The Broncos can give extensions to Brandon Marshall and Todd Davis, but not him. I mean, you have to – what's right is right, what's fair is fair. He's put enough doing. He deserves to be compensated, commiserate to his talent, commiserate to his production. They handed out deals in the past. They opened their checkbook this offseason. It just baffles me how they don't take care of their own in this instance.
Well, we'll see how it shakes out. Right now it's voluntary. Right now it's weight room, it's classroom. And Harris is a veteran, so you don't worry too much about the weight room stuff because I'm sure he's doing what he needs to do to stay in shape. There's no activities taking place on the grass right now, and I'd be surprised if he doesn't have a copy of Vic Fangio's playbook already anyway. So we'll see how it shakes out, but I think that's a pretty good summary of our view and analysis on Chris Harris not showing up to OTAs. And we still have a few other things to get to in today's show. But first, you guys, we got to pay some bills. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back.
This is the Overtime Podcast Network.
All right, Zach, so let's talk about, since we were still on the topic somewhat of Von Miller, another little piece of buzz that came out that I think a lot of people didn't quite pick up on is the fact that Von has chosen to beef it up again. So he said that last year he was playing around 238, 236 pounds, somewhere in there. And to quote him, he said, "It's not bad, but I want to be 248 or 245 or 248. So he's put the weight back on, and he's looking to beef up. And he kind of talked about it a little bit, but it basically just has to do with being able to get off blocks and have a little bit more power, a little bit, that 10 extra pounds or whatever it might be to get off of blocks when he's rushing the passer. To me, it sounds more like a move in order to be a little bit more stout in the run game, Zach.
Right, and also hold up, give him a little more muscle tone. I have no problem with it, and I believe this is the weight he played at Super Bowl 50, so he just wants to get back to something a little more familiar. The good thing about Von and why he's a future Hall of Famer is he wins with equal parts power and speed. So neither's going to be affected. This is not going to affect his game. And in Vic Fangio's defense, you never know what they have planned for him. I mean, he already talked moving around Bradley Chubb, having him rush from the inside, rush from Von Miller's side. They're going to move Miller around too. So it's for the greater good, I feel like.
Here's what he said, quote, "It's when you get locked up with an offensive lineman and where you're able to go with that. At 235, you can go a certain direction with that. When you're locked in with an offensive lineman, 245, you can go just a little bit further with that. At 245 is where I want to be at. It's still not much. It's only 10 pounds. It's not a lot, but I need that 10 pounds. Close quote. So, I think that in this scheme with Vic Fangio's kind of 4-3 under, he's going to be playing a lot more of a strong side linebacker role like he did early in his career. And so he's going to be tasked with setting the edge probably a little bit more than he has in the recent 2 or 3 years. So it's probably a good thing that he's going to put on those extra LBs. And he's proven in the past, Zach, when he was beefier and bigger, that it doesn't really sap his get off, and it doesn't really sap his twitch and explosion.
Yeah, he's not a running back or a wide receiver. I mean, 10 pounds is nothing. They lose that on the field pretty much in water weight every single game. So I'm all for it. If he thinks, and Von knows best and the coaching staff knows best, if they think 10 pounds can make the difference and help the Broncos win more games, I'm all for it.
Now, let's move on and talk about Courtland Sutton, who dropped a little bit of a bomb as well on Tuesday. First of all, it's interesting because, and this was something that Mike Kliss talked about, it had occurred to me, and then I saw him tweeting about it. It was actually quite interesting. Normally, when the team convenes for OTAs, you just like you saw, on defense, the first guy they're going to put out there, Von Miller. Probably the most famous name, the face of the team basically right now, but definitely the face of the defense. And then usually they're going to put forward a stud on offense like Demaryius Thomas or whoever the quarterback is. This time it was Courtland Sutton and Von Miller who were made available. Now, at first glance, no big deal. But right out of the gates, Courtland Sutton's first remark was actually quite interesting, where he basically revealed that he is the number one receiver in Denver in 2019. And Zach, I'll play the clip so that our listeners can hear the tonality. This wasn't to me. Well, let me play the clip first, and then we'll come back and analyze it. Here's what he said really quick.
It's a little different. Coming in as a rookie, you kind of just trying to fill it out. You don't know what to expect. There wasn't. There's nothing that you can really guide through to say this is how I'm supposed to come into it. But having a year under my belt, I know what to expect from myself and what my teammates expect from me. And I'm excited going into this season, knowing that I'm gonna get to be the number one, and I'm gonna get all that look, all that pressure, and I'm excited about that. And I want my teammates to look at me as that leader and that guy that's going to assume that role and take it and go with it as long as I possibly can.
All right, Zach. So to me, obviously there's the content of what he said, but also the tonality. At first, when I realized what he was saying, I thought to myself, is this just a second-year receiver kind of talking about the mindset he's cultivating that, look, I'm going into this as if I'm the number one and all this? I don't think he wasn't talking in a figurative sense. To me, Zach, the Broncos have communicated to Courtland Sutton that the mantle has been passed. He's the number one. And I think it makes a lot of sense because, you might be questioning, well, what? Is Emmanuel Sanders retired or what? But really, if you think about it, Demaryius Thomas was the number one. Sutton was drafted to be his eventual replacement at the X position. And you don't know what the future holds yet for Sanders in terms of his timetable to return.
Yeah, and I love the confidence from Courtland Sutton. I really do. And he's a number one possession receiver for sure on the Broncos. But from what he showed last year, Chad, I thought he was far removed from a number one. I think he had a lot more work to do. And this is a guy who was playing safety in college, so he's not even that well seasoned yet. He's still growing exponentially. I think he's a great number two. I think he's a killer number three. But number one, that's why they kept Emmanuel around for now anyway, because he's a true number one. He's a true game breaker, a true lid lifter, and Sutton is that perfect complement. So I like the confidence. I like the where he's building with Zach Azzani, the receivers coach. I think he can be to that point. He can be an Alshon Jeffrey or Brandon Marshall. But to say it right now before he's even played one game of the sophomore year, it's a little too overconfident to me.
And that's why that's what I'm saying. I don't think it's a matter of a guy being confident. I think this is a matter of the team telling him, you're the number one this year, Courtland, so you need to conduct yourself that way. Like, I really don't think it's a guy just saying, look, I'm the number one now, y'all. Here's my mindset. I'm going to be the best. And I really think that this is the team telling him, you're the man. And obviously look at who they trotted out first to represent the offense. It wasn't Joe Flacco. It was Courtland Sutton. Now, in that particular sense, I'm not reading into too much, but with regard to the fact that because he was the first offensive player to face the media in 2019, I think that does bolster the notion that, look, this isn't just a guy talking. The team is transitioning and has made it clear to him he's going to be the number one. But you brought up a good point, and I wrote about this in the article when I reported on this on Tuesday, which is that, as you said, when he started off the season, number 3 on the depth chart, he was great. He was averaging over 19 yards per catch. I mean, he was phenomenal as the number 3 with him, DT, and Sanders. And then, of course, DT gets dealt ahead of Week 9. Suddenly, he's a starter opposite of Sanders, and he still managed to hold his own. He had an uptick in reps, and you had Vance Joseph talking about his conditioning and all this and that. Well, he still managed to hold his own and perform as the number 2. But where it really got sketchy was ahead of Week 13. I think it was after Week 13. So 14, 15, 16, 17. Yeah. So after Week 13, after the Cincinnati game, Sanders tears his Achilles, and now Sutton is suddenly the number 1. For a full quarter of the season, the final 4 games, he's the number 1 in Denver. That's when the offense took a nosedive, went off the cliff. He had 2 games, Zach, in which he posted 2 or less receptions. And he talked about that that's one of the lessons he learned from being a number 1 that final quarter of the season is, look, you can't go into a game with one and come out of it with 1 or 2 receptions. You got to be a guy that's coming away with 6, 7, 8 catches week in and week out. But Zach, in order for that to happen, you want to know the biggest difference between the wherewithal or acumen of Sanders and Sutton? It's not wingspan. It's not necessarily the ability to win jump balls and contested balls and all that, and back shoulders. It's the fact that Sanders is a prolific and accomplished route runner. And Sutton, just like you spoke to, he's still learning the whole wide receiver thing. Take that next step. That's what he needs to do. In his second year as a route runner, maybe learn a little something from Deshaun Hamilton, who's a very polished route runner. And if he can get that aspect of it down and get his hands down, because there was a few times on slants especially last year where he dropped too many balls, he does have the potential to be that number 1. I mean, his ceiling, Sutton, is ridiculously high, but I think the Broncos are treading into, if they're really going to put all their chips on Courtland Sutton as the number 1 this year, it's sketchy ground, because if you look back at Joe Flacco's most prolific seasons in Baltimore, he was throwing to proven veterans like Steve Smith, Anquan Bolden, Torrey Smith, and so that's one of the reasons why obviously you're seeing the Broncos keep Emmanuel Sanders around. But I think they're maybe, remiss in this early in the process crowning Sutton as the number 1.
I don't think there's any doubt that they're positioning Sutton to be the star in this offense, Chad. I feel like they're missing out. They have FOMO after losing DT and Sanders becoming injured and being out of the picture and losing his star power. They want a receiver representing the offense. I just think this early in the process, like you just said, before the draft, not knowing how Sanders' recovery is going to go, to pin him already as the number one, it's pigeonholing themselves, Chad, unnecessarily. I just don't think you can put that pressure on the guy. Even if they told him in private, you're going to be the number one, I would let him develop into that role. He's still not even a proven number two just yet. So I would let the draft play out. I would let OTAs play out, see what Sanders does. And if they can come back, I mean, regardless, Flacco loves possession receivers. He had Michael Crabtree last year he liked throwing to. He likes the big body types. Yeah. Sutton is going to have a role in this offense. He's going to be involved. Oh, but number one, I don't know about that just yet.
Well, that's the whole thing is you have to be able to create separation even when the opposing defense comes into a game planning to take you out of it by putting their number one receiver on you, number one corner on you, and then putting safety help over the top, which is what they did last year. Is the opposing team, starting with Richard Sherman in Week 14 in San Fran, they played press coverage, struggled to get off the line of scrimmage, and then in terms of being available in the vertical game, he always had a safety over the top because there was no one else really that they feared as a receiver by that point. So it was just Sutton. And so as a number one, you still have to be able to win in those situations, and that's why, and that's where route running comes into play, and he's just not there yet. It's still going to take time. And with receivers, and this was something that if those of you listening tuned into the Building the Broncos episode on Wednesday in which Benjamin Albright appeared, and Albright was talking about that with receivers, it usually takes 2 to 2.5 years for them to really turn the corner in their development and begin to produce. And it's pretty true. I mean, you can think back to when Demaryius Thomas entered the league in 2010 as a first-round pick. You know, granted, in his case, he was banged up. He was drafted with a foot injury, but his rookie year, I think it was something like 200-300 yards, something like that. His second year, the Tebow year, he missed a good portion of the first part of the season, and then came on strong the second half. 500 yards receiving, something like that. And then Peyton came year 3, and it just happened to coincide with also that third year where they take the giant leap forward. Suddenly he's putting up whatever it was, 90-some-odd catches and over 1,200 yards receiving, double-digit touchdowns. Sutton, it's going to take time, just like DT did, to turn that corner, Zach.
Speaking to that, though, I mean, look at the fact that he was a raw player coming out of college, and then now he's already on his second offensive coordinator, his second scheme, his second quarterback. I mean, you're already delaying his progress in that sense alone. Why you would let him ace being a number 2 receiver, Chad, before you even think about giving him those wide receiver 1 responsibilities.
No doubt about it. And also listening to the Building the Broncos pod on Wednesday, another thing to take away from what Albright had to say is that there's no concern, apparently, at Dove Valley that Emmanuel Sanders won't be available by the season opener. They fully expect him to be good to go. It sounds like the team's expectation, and you wrote about this a few weeks back. I can't remember exactly how long ago it was now, Zach, in the offseason, but that Sanders was ahead of schedule, right, on his recovery from Achilles. Now, we got to remember that happened, it was either late November, early December when he suffered that Achilles tear, and yet the team still, according to Albright, is confident he's going to be good to go by opening week. So maybe that's just them still trying to build his trade value, but I think it's true that he's going to be good to go. So I'm not too worried about this because Sutton can be the X while Sanders can be the Z. So, it takes two. And as long as Sanders is back in time, I'm a little bit more nervous now. Like before the offseason started, Zach, I was a lot more amenable to the idea of trading Emmanuel Sanders. But now that you got Joe Flacco, and it's about winning now, and it's not so much about building for the future. You still got to consider that, but we know how the Broncos are thinking. They want to win now. That's why they got Flacco. And with that in mind, I think you need to keep Emmanuel Sanders here, even if you get a really tasty trade offer, unless it's one you just simply can't refuse, like a second-round pick or even a third-round pick maybe. You got to keep Sanders around so that Flacco has a proven and accomplished veteran. Let's not forget, Emmanuel Sanders contributed to a world championship, and he has produced 3 1,000-yard receiving seasons as a Bronco.
I mean, not only would I keep Sanders, I would add more burners in the draft. In your mock, Chad, you had Emmanuel Hall and Penny Hart. Those are two great options. The more the merrier. They don't really have any strict burners on the roster other than Sanders, and he's coming off an injury which saps explosiveness. Sutton and Hamilton and Tim Patrick are possession guys. They need guys who can get down the field. Brendan Langley, to me, is not that guy. So I would, you can never have too many offensive weapons, especially for a quarterback like Joe Flacco, who loves throwing downfield. I would not put all my eggs in Sanders' basket, just as I wouldn't for Courtland Sutton. I would add more to the fold. It's never bad to have too much competition.
We'll see how it shakes out, you guys. We still got a lot left to go in terms of the offseason. We're on the home stretch in terms of the draft. We are in the month of the draft, so that's going to be here before we know it. And it's going to be really fun these remaining weeks leading up to the draft. We got a lot of cool content planned for you, not only on the website, but here on the podcast. So stay tuned for that. But in the meantime, that's going to do it for today's episode of the Huddle Up Podcast. As always, you guys, make sure you are following the show on Twitter. Don't forget, if you haven't done this, to leave your creative review and rate the show on iTunes. You can find my partner, Zack Kelberman, on Twitter, at Kelberman247, myself, at Chad N. Jensen. And for those of you who are VIP subscribers of Mile High Huddle and 24/7 Sports, I put out the thread, the weekly thread for the VIP mailbag for Friday's episode. Go find that. You can find it on my Twitter and the Huddle Up Podcast Twitter, or just go to the MHH Insiders Forum. You'll see the thread there. Put your questions in. Zach and I will knock each one of them down on Friday. For Zack Kelberman, I'm Chad Jensen. We'll talk to you then.
You've been listening to the Huddle Up Podcast. Join Broncos Country's deep divers at milehighhuddle.com to keep the conversation going.